He looked with hatred on the Eldar, and he feared the men of Numenor who came back at whiles on their ships to the shores of Middle-earth. But for long he dissembled his mind and concealed the dark designs that he shaped in his heart. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are taking a look at Sauron's main strategy for victory that started in the Second Age, and, in many ways, continued right up until the end of the Third Age, with Sauron's fall and the end of the One Ring. We will see today if Sauron truly needed the rings to win in Middle-earth, or if there were other ways he might have used. Sources that helped in the creation of today's video may be found in the description and cards. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Based on Sauron's perspective during the Second Age, we'll start by saying that, at least, this whole Rings of Power plan seemed to be the best option for him, tricking the Free Peoples and thralling them through these rings. Of course, we as the audience have perspectives throughout the stories that Sauron simply doesn't, being in the lore, particularly at the time of the Second Age. Only we know how truly strong or weak the forces of the West were at different times throughout the story, something Sauron was of course not always privy to. So in some sense, trickery and enthrallment, particularly against men whom he had always found easier to sway to evil, and dwarves who are not always friendly with the elves to say the least, could certainly be the best option at different points against the elves. Particularly when it seemed to Sauron that the Valar had turned their eyes away again from Middle-earth after the end of the War of Wrath, but perhaps might turn their eyes back if there would be another great war. But this didn't mean that it was the only way forward, of course. We'll get back to that in a second. From Sauron's perspective, he just saw his master, the most powerful singular being in all the world, get beaten in a war that ended an age and destroyed a continent. Whether or not the Valar, or any of their direct servants or Maiar, would also return to stop Sauron in a similar way, especially after Sauron fled from Eonwë's mercy at the end of the First Age, surely was in question for Sauron. He could not be sure that they would stay away if he dominated Middle-earth militarily, if he even could, but turning these people, men, elves, and dwarves against each other, making the very children of Eru do his bidding, making things more morally ambiguous and complicated should the Valar or their people try to intervene, would seem to Sauron a more complete victory in total, absolutely. Of course, there was pride and vanity involved, as it always is for Sauron, but actually, dominion through trickery, deceit, and corruption certainly seemed a better and more sure path to victory for the Dark Lord. Especially when he came to fear the Númenóreans, hate the elves, and not be quite so sure about the dwarves. Now, one point I've wondered about in all of this was, what was his plan for the rings and their respective peoples originally, versus what ended up happening? Honestly, it seems that the 16 rings, those of men and dwarves eventually, were originally intended for elves, since they stayed at Rhaegion until Sauron stormed the land and took them back to distribute them later as his Plan B. Had the three most powerful elven rings not been crafted, it's actually very likely that Sauron would have simply won against the elves at the onset of the War of the Elves and Sauron, as the Dark Lord was not aware that the three had been made, and perhaps his domination over the minds of the bearers of the 16 would have been so total and complete that the elves would have also just totally fallen under Sauron when he donned his own one ring of power. But even so, he decided that the rings had failed at this point, but perhaps he could still use them later. He invaded Rhaegion, hoping that raw military strength would be enough to undo the elves, and then he could use the rings that the elves had made to afterwards unmake the factions of men and dwarves in Middle-earth, at least the 16. Of the three, he perhaps had other plans for, fearing them and really wanting to know where they were. But to use men and dwarves as his thralls and slaves to create and guard his dominion, and to keep him safe from the Valar in the west while he destroyed the elves, seemed a good plan B for him. Again, his plans did change when the elves realized his deception, which I speak of more in my video on Sauron's different plans and how his strategy continued to evolve throughout the ages. And still, even with his plans not quite happening how he had wished them to get back to this question of our video here, Sauron proved multiple times that he could almost nearly certainly win without the rings. For if the Númenóreans had not arrived when they did, Sauron would have destroyed the elves and dominated in Middle-earth during that war, with or without the rings. So ultimately, did Sauron need the rings to win in the end? Well, seeing that ultimately he didn't win even with the rings, and even after he gave the rings to dwarves and they did not enthrall them as he intended, and he gave them to men, which, yeah, made them Nazgul, but still they did not necessarily bring all of these followers of men under his sway, perhaps, I would argue that Sauron did not need the rings to win, and he might have won without them had he planned for different outcomes along the way. I think a lot of Sauron's issues in terms of him not being victorious was that he made a lot of core assumptions that turned out to be incorrect all throughout the story. Now, of course, this is what makes him a compelling character when we really hone in on him and his perspectives during each age. He wasn't always right, he wasn't always wrong, but honestly, he was quite pragmatic, yet let his ego and his arrogance get in the way of his own plans. For instance, I think that with the Rings of Power, he made assumptions that corrupting certain leaders and kings into wraiths and Nazgul would motivate their people to follow them. That might have worked with some factions, like maybe the Easterlings or the Men of the South, but the Númenórean Nazgul might have only brought a few black Númenóreans, yet the majority of the Númenóreans that survived the downfall actually still opposed Sauron. The dwarves obviously didn't fall into his trap, really at all, and they continued to oppose him. Sure, they were corrupted in their own ways and made more greedy and so forth, but it didn't really help Sauron all that much. The Free Peoples did not act as monoliths in that way. They did not blindly follow their leader in an autocratic or a dictatorial way, something Sauron might not have understood, to be honest, because he was so used to that being the case in his faction and when he followed Melkor. The leader, the Dark Lord, was always absolute, and you couldn't really question them. But that's not what we see with the Free Peoples. When Theoden was cursed and ill, for instance, in the Third Age, sure, his people continued to follow him overall, but even some of his most loyal men and kinsmen rejected his orders to blindly let orcs and uruks into the land, or to regard Saruman as an ally when he clearly wasn't anymore. The Free Peoples questioned things, and honestly, many of them rejected evil when they saw it, even when it was presented to them in the guise of something good and fair. Whether it was the elves who rejected Anatar and his gifts in Lindon, forcing him to go to Eregion, or the faithful men who rejected Sauron in Númenor, that led to the foundation of Gondor and Arnor, or the dwarves that would never side with Sauron no matter his promises, all of these different moments show that the Free Peoples, I think, were different than Sauron believed them to be. They were different from the people Sauron would associate with, his own servants and thralls. So yes, while the Rings of Power did in some ways help Sauron, particularly by creating his 9 most powerful and loyal servants in the Nazgul, I think the Rings of Power, at least there's an argument to be made that they actually fell quite short of Sauron's expectations. Had he considered the entire board, not just parts of it, had Sauron not always trusted his own assumptions to be true, he could have had victory at many different points in the tale, throughout the Second and Third Ages. By perhaps planning for and blockading the Númenóreans during the War of the Elves and Sauron, he might have had victory then. Or by continuing to use deceit and manipulation, he could have turned the factions that would turn into the Last Alliance and their victory against each other, instead of him. Through perhaps pressing weak spots with his own armies during different times in the Second or Third Ages, he could have had that military victory. Of course, it was a great thing for the Free Peoples that none of that happened, but this is all to say that the Rings of Power were a good strategy to employ for Sauron, especially from the outset. It seemed like a pretty good plan. I think he could have won without them, or at least he could have had victory had he not relied so solely and heavily on the Rings of Power in the Second Age. It's hard not to see that project overall as a general failure for Sauron that actually eventually led to his final demise in the Third Age, with the destruction of his One Ring. Had he not created the rings at all, perhaps, he might have died during the downfall of Númenor or at the end of the Second Age, sure, but I think without the One Ring, he would have changed so many of his strategies that perhaps he could have had victory had he not put so much belief into his Rings of Power. To be fair to Sauron as a character, he had to make a lot of assumptions in a lot of different moments, but so many of these assumptions actually turned out to be wrong, or included pieces of the puzzle that he could have anticipated but really didn't. So what do you all think? This is a very complicated question, and since we don't know what Sauron was thinking about during so many different points in the story, we do have to take guesses on what his assumptions were. Again, I feel that he was honestly probably disappointed overall by what the rings ended up doing for him, with the exceptions of creating Nazgul, allowing his spirit to endure if the One Ring did, as well as creating that failsafe of corruption that would make the One Ring nearly impossible to willingly destroy. But again, most of these things say more about a few rings versus all of the rings. I think he had hoped for far more and received way less, and all of those years, skills, and energy dedicated to the plan involving the Rings of Power might have actually helped him achieve victory elsewhere had he gone a different direction. And so, my friends, that's where we will end our discussion in this video, but again, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. From this tale, we see that we must anticipate our best laid plans to change, for if we do not, such dedication to those plans will be our weakness. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. I've always been fascinated with Sauron's plan about the rings, because it's just so different and creative. It's not just dominion and destruction, but his plan actually capitalizes on greed and lust to ensure destruction, but it didn't actually end up going that way. If you would like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Wedded or United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch and Patreon. Also, please check out Z-Wood and their wood-carved maps and clocks, and use the code in the description for 15% off at checkout. Thank you so much, and thanks to our Valor Tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, John Hume, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Andrew Carlisle, and Zumi. Patreon and YouTube memberships are the best way to support the channel, so if you do decide to, I really appreciate it. It really means a lot to me. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the free peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with a new type of video. I'm still thinking about how I'll do it, but it should serve as some sort of introduction for people to get deeper into the lore of Tolkien, bridging that gap between known and generally unknown lore, so we can expand our community of friends as we dive ever deeper into Tolkien's stories. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.